There's a specific kind of silence that exists just before the world wakes up. Not peaceful silence, not the comfortable kind you get on a Sunday morning when the house is empty and the coffee is warm. This is a different kind entirely. It presses against you. It has weight. And if you've ever stood anywhere near the outer gates of St. James's Palace at 4:30 in the morning, not as a tourist, not as a passerby, but as someone who had to be there, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. I had to be there. I'll explain why in a moment, but first, let me tell you what I saw. It was the second week of November. Not the brutal cold of deep winter, not yet, but close enough that your breath came out in little clouds and your fingers went numb if you forgot your gloves. I had forgotten mine. Typical. I remember standing near the railings on Marlborough Road, hands shoved into the pockets of my coat, staring across the empty tarmac at the figure standing in the sentry box. And I don't mean staring casually. I mean the kind of staring you do when something about a person stops your brain mid-thought, and you can't quite explain why. He hadn't moved in 11 minutes. I'd been watching. I know that sounds strange. Maybe it is. But there was a reason I was out there at that hour, standing alone in the November dark, counting the minutes a soldier didn't move. Let me back up. My name isn't important for this. What matters is that 3 years ago, I worked as a civilian researcher attached to a heritage documentation project connected to the household division. Not military, not intelligence, just someone hired to sit in archive rooms and pull old records and help write the kind of dense institutional history that nobody except specialists actually reads. My job was boring by design. And then, completely by accident, it became the most unusual few months of my working life. It started with a request. My supervisor, a quiet man named Gerald who wore the same brown cardigan 3 days out of 5 and made tea with 2 bags like a man who needed to feel something, asked me to observe 1 full shift rotation at St. James's as part of what he called contextual field documentation. His words. What he meant was, go stand outside in the cold, watch the guard change, and write it down in language that doesn't put people to sleep. So I did. First time it was midday, tourists everywhere, people holding up phones, pressing against the railings, whispering to each other in 6 different languages. A Japanese couple to my left was photographing the guard with the kind of focused reverence usually reserved for religious sites. A pair of teenagers near the gate were daring each other to make the soldier blink. Sunlight on the gold buttons, bearskin hats catching the autumn light. All of it very grand, very official, very much what you'd expect. I wrote my notes. I submitted them. Gerald made tea and nodded and said it was good groundwork. Then he asked me to come back, but this time he said, come before sunrise. He didn't explain why. Gerald rarely explained things directly. He just handed me a laminated pass and said, the handover before dawn is different. You'll understand when you see it. So that's why I was there, standing in the dark, watching a soldier who hadn't moved in 11 minutes, wondering what Gerald had meant and starting to think I was beginning to understand. The palace grounds in the pre-dawn hours have a character that the daytime version doesn't even hint at. The tourists are gone. The barriers are still up, but they stand there like props abandoned on a stage after the performance ends. There are pigeons somewhere, shuffling on roof ledges, making that low sound like distant machinery. The lamps along the mall cast this amber light that barely reaches the pavement before it gives up and fades into darkness. I had arrived at 4:15. The handover was scheduled, and this is significant for 5:07. Not 5 o'clock, not 5:15, 5:07. I had learned enough in my archive work to know that military timing at this level wasn't approximate. It wasn't roughly 5. It was 5:07, and there was a reason for that specific minute, rooted somewhere in a procedural document written decades ago and revised only twice since. I found a position on the pavement that gave me a clear sightline without getting close enough to cause any kind of concern. A plainclothes officer had already noted me, nodded at my pass, and gone back to looking at nothing in particular, which is its own skill. that looking at nothing look, I've come to realize it's actually looking at everything. The guard in the sentry box was Lance Corporal Daniel Marsh. I didn't know his name then. I learned it later from the documentation. But standing there in the dark, I only knew him as a silhouette, shoulders perfectly level, rifle at his side, head forward, not a flicker. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known from the outside, was what he was carrying. What most people understand about the Royal Guard is the surface version, the ceremonial part, the bearskin, the red tunic, the boots that shine like black glass. They understand it as performance, British pageantry, something for the cameras. And I don't blame them for that. The performance is real. The discipline required to stand for 2 hours without acknowledging a camera flash in your face, without reacting when some tourist shouts something deliberately stupid 6 inches from your ear, that discipline is extraordinary. I've seen the training footage. I know what it takes. There's nothing hollow about it. But the performance is also a shell. Inside the shell is a different thing entirely. A living, breathing intelligence network that most people will never think about, because the whole architecture of it is designed to be invisible. And the handover, that specific window just before dawn, when one guard relieves another, is one of the moments when the inside of the shell briefly becomes visible, if you know how to look. Let me tell you what I mean by that. The guard rotation at the royal residences operates on what's called a staggered cycle. Different posts, different timings, structured so that there is never a moment when a relieving soldier arrives without overlap from the departing one. The handover is not a simple swap. One person walks away, another takes position. It's a transfer. And what gets transferred isn't only the post. Information gets transferred too. Not written down. Not filed in a report that goes upstairs to some committee. Spoken, directly, in a window of about 90 seconds, sometimes less, during which 2 soldiers stand close enough to each other that the words go nowhere except from one mouth to one ear. What kind of information? That was the question I had been sent to understand. At 4:53, the relief party emerged from the internal gate. I heard them before I saw them, not because they were loud, because they were the opposite of loud, but because the quality of the silence changed. It's hard to describe, like the pressure shifting slightly, like the dark rearranging itself. There were 3 of them, the corporal of the guard who would supervise the handover, the relieving sentry, and a third figure who stayed slightly back, whose role I wouldn't fully understand until I read the post-shift documentation 2 days later. They walked in a formation that looked almost casual but wasn't. Everything about the movement was calibrated, the spacing between them, the pace, where their eyes went. And here's the thing that stayed with me that I kept coming back to when I was writing my notes later. None of them looked at me. They looked at everything around me, above me, beyond me, but not at me. Which meant they knew I was there, had known since I arrived, the looking at nothing technique operating perfectly. The corporal of the guard, his name was Harrison, I learned later, a man with a decade and a half of service, and the particular kind of stillness that comes not from training alone, but from having lived inside that training long enough that it stops being training and starts being personality, stopped 3 paces from Lance Corporal Marsh. He didn't say anything for a moment. Neither did Marsh. And in that pause, something happened that I still think about. Marsh's eyes moved, just slightly, just enough to register the arrival, a blink-and-you-miss-it acknowledgement, and in it, I thought I saw something that surprised me. Not relief exactly, not the eagerness of someone desperate to get out of the cold, something more complicated. Like a man who had been holding a weight for a long time and had been holding it so steadily for so long that he wasn't entirely sure how to begin the process of passing it to someone else. That's when I first really understood what Gerald had meant. The handover wasn't just logistical. It was personal. The exchange began. I couldn't hear the words. I want to be clear about that. The distance was too great, and whatever they said was said quietly by design. What I could see was the body language, the timing, the precision of it. Harrison leaned in slightly. Marsh responded with something brief. Harrison again, a little longer this time. Then a moment where both of them went completely still, which lasted maybe 4 seconds but felt much longer. Then something from Marsh that made Harrison's jaw tighten, barely perceptibly, just a slight shift in the line of his face. He heard something he hadn't expected. That much was clear. He nodded once. Marsh said something else, 2 or 3 words. Harrison glanced briefly but deliberately toward the northeast corner of the courtyard, then back to Marsh. Another nod, this one slower. The whole exchange lasted 78 seconds. I timed it. Then it was done. Marsh stepped away from the post with the measured, unhurried movement of a man who has been still for 2 hours and has learned that the trick to not looking exhausted is to move as if you aren't. Harrison took his position. The third figure moved to a specific point near the inner gate, spoke quietly into a radio, and received a response I couldn't hear. And it was over. Just like that. The sky was beginning to shift at the eastern edges. Not light yet, not quite, but the promise of it. That gray-blue thing that happens when darkness starts to become uncertain about itself. I stood there for another few minutes, not writing anything, just thinking. I went back to Gerald's office 2 days later and asked him directly, what is it that gets past in that window? What kind of information? He poured his tea, 2 bags as always. Anomalies, he said, like it was obvious. What kind of anomalies? He looked at me over his cup. The kind that don't quite rise to the level of an incident, not yet, but that need to be carried forward, passed on, so the next pair of eyes already has context. He let that sit for a moment. A vehicle parked in the same position for the 3rd time in 4 days. A person who walked the outer perimeter twice in 1 hour, which is the kind of thing a tourist does exactly once. A sound from a direction that doesn't match anything scheduled. Small things, individually meaningless, together possibly a pattern. He set his cup down. The handover is when those small things move from one person's awareness to the next, verbally. Because verbal is faster and leaves no record that an adversary could intercept. I sat with that for a long moment. So the ceremony, I said slowly, the part everyone photographs, is real, he said firmly. The discipline is real, the history is real, none of it is theater. But it's also a frame, he said, around something else. He went back to his cardigan and his files and didn't say anything more about it. I drove home and sat in my car in the dark for a while, thinking about a man standing motionless in a sentry box at 4:30 in the morning, carrying something invisible, waiting for the exact right moment to pass it on. 3 weeks after my first pre-dawn observation, I was granted permission to speak with 2 former members of the household division under conditions of confidentiality. No recordings, no direct attributions, notes permitted, but to be reviewed before use. I want to be careful here about what I share, because some of what I was told sits in a space that isn't classified. None of it was, but is sensitive in the way that procedural detail about security practices tends to be sensitive. I'm going to tell you what I was told in general terms, and I'm going to tell you why it mattered. The first man, I'll call him R, had served at Buckingham Palace and St. James's across 2 separate postings, roughly 12 years apart. He was in his 50s when I met him. Quiet. The kind of person who thinks before he speaks, not because he's unsure of himself, but because he respects the weight of words. He drank black coffee and sat with his hands flat on the table, which I noticed because most people fidget and he simply didn't. He told me about a night in his second posting that he said he thought about more than he probably should. It was a Tuesday, he said, or rather, it was very early Wednesday morning. The handover shift was due just before 5. He was the departing sentry, had been at his post since 3, which was a longer stretch than usual due to a scheduling adjustment he didn't go into detail about. Sometime around 4:40, maybe a little after, he had noticed something. Not dramatic. That's the first thing he wanted me to understand. This wasn't a film moment. He didn't clock a sniper or intercept a message or anything that would make a good poster. What he noticed was a light. A specific window in a building facing onto the courtyard. Residential, 3rd floor. The light had come on at 4:17. He'd noted the time automatically, the way you do when you've been trained to log temporal detail, and had gone off again at 4:23, 6 minutes, then back on at 4:38, 15 minutes later, then off, then on again at 4:51. Irregular, inconsistent. On its own, nothing. Could be insomnia, could be someone checking on a child, could be any one of 100 domestic explanations. But R said, "You file it in here." He tapped his temple. "And when the corporal comes for the handover, you pass it. You describe the window, the floor, the timing pattern. You say, 'I don't know what it is, but it was there and it was irregular and I want you to carry it forward.'" "What happened with that one?" I asked him. He paused. "Nothing," he said. "As far as I know, nothing came of it. It was followed up. Routine inquiry, probably exactly what it looked like, someone who couldn't sleep." He took a drink of coffee. "But that's the wrong question." "What's the right question?" "The right question is, what if it hadn't been nothing? What if the person receiving the handover had decided it wasn't worth mentioning because it seemed too small? What if they'd filtered it out before it got to the next person in the chain?" He looked at me steadily. "The training exists specifically to stop you from deciding what matters before you pass it on. Your job in the handover isn't to analyze, it's to transfer, clean, complete, without your own conclusions getting in the way." That landed somewhere and stayed there. The second person I spoke with, a woman, which surprised some people when I mentioned it later, though it shouldn't have, had served in a different capacity within the household division support structure. Administrative and operational. She was younger than R, precise in her language, with a habit of correcting herself mid-sentence when she felt she'd been imprecise. I liked her immediately. She told me about the intelligence passed in handovers from a different angle. Not what the content was, but how the system had evolved. The verbal handover, she explained, wasn't always the practice. There had been periods when written logs were the primary method, brief field notes passed between shifts, reviewed by the NCO on duty, filed upward through the chain. Formal, traceable, in some ways more thorough. The shift toward verbal came from a combination of factors, some procedural, some practical. Speed was part of it. The handover window was tight, and written logs had an inherent lag. You wrote what you remembered, which meant you were already filtering, already organizing, already losing the texture of the original observation by the time pen hit paper. But there was something else. A written report, she said, is a finished thing. When it leaves your hand, it's complete. It has a form. Someone reads it and responds to the form. She paused, choosing her next words. A verbal transfer is still alive. The person receiving it can ask a question in the moment. Can say, "Wait, describe that vehicle again. What direction were the wheels turned?" And the person giving the transfer, who has been standing at that post for 2 hours and has that scene still living behind their eyes, can answer in a way they couldn't have on paper because they didn't know that detail was the relevant one until the question was asked. She described it as a living document. 2 people, 90 seconds. A specific kind of conversation that has no template and needs none because the person asking has the same training as the person answering, and they both already understand the landscape they're navigating together. "It sounds almost conversational," I said. "It is conversational," she said. "That's the point. Everything about the exterior ceremony, the formality. The precision of movement is structure. And inside that structure, you have this brief window of genuine human communication. 2 people talking quietly in the dark about what they've seen. That's the moment when the whole system actually functions. I wrote that down almost word for word. I wasn't supposed to, technically, but I did, and I don't regret it. I went back to the palace 3 more times over the following month. Each time I arrived before 4. Each time I stood in approximately the same position on Marlborough Road with my pass and my notebook and my inadequate coat. Each time the sky was different. Once it rained lightly, and the pavement turned reflective, and the lamplight scattered across it in broken shapes. Once there was actual frost. Once, on a night so still and clear that the stars were visible above the city glow, I stood there and felt something I hadn't expected to feel about a heritage documentation project. I felt the weight of it. Not the weight of the institution, though that's real and I felt that too, but the specific weight of what I was watching, which was a series of individuals rotating through that cold and that dark and that silence, doing something almost invisible in service of something enormous, and finding their own way to carry the night's knowledge forward, passing it hand to hand, spoken into the ear of the next person in line, gone as far as the public record was concerned, but not gone. Alive in the next person's awareness, carried forward into the next shift, the next day, the next season. A living document. The night that mattered most was the third one. I almost didn't go. The rain had been relentless for 2 days. I was tired, I was behind on my actual writing deadlines, and Gerald had not specifically asked me to make another observation visit. He'd simply not said I shouldn't. There's a version of me that stayed home that night. I think about that version sometimes. But I went. I arrived at 4:10. The rain had stopped finally, but everything was wet and the air had that sharp electric quality that follows heavy rain, like the atmosphere is still vibrating from the effort. The courtyard stones were dark and gleaming. The lamps had halos in the mist. The departing sentry that night was a soldier I hadn't observed before. Younger, I thought, there's something in the set of someone's shoulders that telegraphs experience, and this one was slightly more angular, slightly less settled than the others I'd watched. Not inexperienced, don't misread that, the training doesn't permit inexperience at this post, but newer to this particular assignment. You could feel the difference in the way he occupied his position. Not worse, just different. Like a note played at the right pitch, but not yet worn into the instrument. He'd been at post for 2.5 hours. And at 4:43, something had happened that I had been standing too far away to properly register at the time. I learned what it was later, but I'll tell you now because it's the heart of this part of the story. At 4:43, a man had approached the outer boundary from the direction of the park. Not running, not shouting, moving with the kind of excessive casualness that sometimes reads as deliberate, like someone performing the act of casual walking rather than simply doing it. He had stopped at a point roughly 15 meters from the sentry box. He had stood there for approximately 2 minutes. The young guard had not moved, had not reacted, had not blinked in the man's direction by even a degree. But he had seen him, had cataloged him, had started a clock. At 2 minutes and some seconds, the man had turned and walked away, back toward the park, unhurried, gone. Normal, possibly. The parks around the palaces attract all kinds at all hours. The city is full of insomniacs and nightwalkers and people who can't explain why they're standing somewhere at 4 in the morning. Probably nothing. But also noted. When the relief party came at 5:07, precise as always, the young guard's handover lasted longer than the standard 70 to 90 seconds. I timed it at 112 seconds. Something extra was being passed, a fuller description. The corporal of the guard stood absolutely still while the younger man spoke, and I could see even at distance the particular quality of attention in Harrison's body. That was Harrison again, same corporal I'd seen on my first visit that you develop when you're receiving information you're going to have to carry and respond to. Not nodding, not reacting, just receiving, storing, building the picture. Then 2 brief questions, I think, based on the exchange. Short answers, another moment of stillness. Then the formal completion of the handover. The position changed hands. The young guard walked away toward the inner gate. He was about halfway across the courtyard when he stopped, turned back, said one more thing to Harrison, just a handful of words, something he'd remembered or reconsidered in those few steps away. Harrison listened, nodded once, a single slow dip of his head. The young guard turned back and completed his walk to the gate. And Harrison took up his position and became what the sentry box required him to be, still, silent, present, holding now everything the previous man had held, plus the thing that had been added at the end in those last few words across a wet courtyard just before dawn. I stood there for a long time afterward. The sky was beginning to change. Here's what tourists photograph. The bearskin. Always the bearskin. There's something about it, the height of it, the absurdity of it by modern standards, the way it frames the face beneath it so that the soldier seems to exist in another century while simultaneously occupying this one, that makes it irresistible. If you stand near the railings for more than 5 minutes, you'll watch someone hold up their phone and compose the shot they've seen 1,000 times in other people's travel photographs. The angle, the guard in the box, the gold buttons. Maybe a red telephone box in the background, if the composition allows. And I understand it. I really do. It's a striking image. The whole visual vocabulary of it, centuries of military ceremony crystallized into a single frame, is genuinely, objectively arresting. But you'll never see someone photograph the handover at 4 in the morning. Not because they aren't allowed to. The outer positions are publicly accessible, technically. Not because the thing itself isn't worth seeing. It is, in the way that most genuinely important things are worth seeing. But because almost nobody is there, and the people who are there aren't the kind who photograph things. That absence, the unbothered, unphotographed, unbroadcast nature of that pre-dawn ritual, is, I've come to think, part of what makes it function. Let me tell you about the conversation I had with R, the former guard, the one with the flat hands on the table, near the end of our interview. We'd been talking for almost 2 hours. He'd answered my questions carefully, steered around the things he couldn't discuss, given me the shape of things without always filling in the detail. At the end, I asked him something that I hadn't planned to ask. It came out of something he'd said earlier, about the way the training stops being training and starts being personality. I asked him, what do you actually feel standing at that post at 4 in the morning, underneath the training? What's actually going on inside you? He was quiet for a moment, long enough that I started to think he wasn't going to answer. Accountable, he said. That's the word that comes closest. Not nervous, not proud. Not, and I want to be clear about this, not robotic, just accountable. There's something at your back, something that extends a long way behind you and a long way ahead of you. You're a point in a line, and the line has to hold. Not because someone will be watching and judging, because the person who comes next needs you to have been paying attention. He picked up his coffee. That's what the handover is, really. Not information transfer, not intelligence, it's proof. You're proving to the next person in line that the line held, that the watch was clean. And if something happened, if you saw something, if the night brought something you didn't expect, then you're carrying that forward honestly, not cleaning it up, not deciding it wasn't worth their time, carrying it forward whole as it was. He put the cup down. The ceremony people see is about continuity, yes. History, tradition, all of that. But the handover before dawn is the same thing in a different key. It's one person saying to the next, I was here. I saw what was there to be seen. Now you carry it. I finished my documentation report in February. Gerald read it over the course of a week, which for Gerald was rapid. He came back with 2 pages of notes, suggestions, mostly some questions. 1 paragraph-length observation about the section on verbal transfer protocols that opened up a line of thinking I hadn't fully developed. At the end of his notes in his careful, slightly cramped handwriting, He'd written one line. "You understood what you were looking at. That doesn't happen as often as you'd think." I folded that page in half and kept it, still have it. I want to tell you about one more thing before I finish. On my last observation visit, a morning in late January, so cold that the frost was still thick on the pavement at 4:30 and my breath was a continuous cloud, I arrived earlier than usual, 3:50. The post was occupied. The sentry was a woman, corporal, I later confirmed, with just under 4 years at this rotation, standing in a position so composed it seemed almost architectural. As if she and the sentry box, and the darkness and the frost, had all agreed to be exactly where they were. I watched her for a long time. She didn't move. Of course she didn't move. That's the whole point, the whole surface purpose, the discipline and the stillness and the visible demonstration of exactly that quality. But there was something in the stillness that morning that felt different from the other observations. I've tried to find the right word for it since, and the best I can manage is inhabited, not like a person performing stillness, like a person in whom stillness had come to live. And somewhere behind those eyes, behind whatever they were trained to project, behind the uniform and the frost and the dark, she was watching, cataloging, building the picture, carrying the night's accumulation of small and large observations, every shifted shadow and irregular sound and vehicle and figure, everything the darkness had offered up in the hours since she took this post, holding it carefully, knowing that in the moment of handover, she would give it clean and whole to the person who came next. The relief party appeared at 5:07. I watched the corporal of the guard approach, watched the geometry of the two figures close, watched the handover begin, that specific, protected, 90-second conversation that the public record doesn't hold, that no camera captures, that exists only in the transfer between one mind and another, spoken in the dark just before the city wakes up. She spoke, he listened, she spoke again. He asked something I could tell by the slight shift in his posture, the small lean forward of a man putting a question. She answered. He nodded. 3-4 seconds of shared stillness. Done. She stepped away. He took position. She crossed the courtyard, steady, unhurried, back straight, not looking at anything except exactly where she was going. The city was beginning to wake at its edges. The first light was happening, not sudden, not dramatic, just a slow lightening of the horizon above the roofline, as if the night was remembering it had somewhere to be and starting, reluctantly, to leave. I put my notebook away. I'd stopped taking notes halfway through the observation. There was something about watching it that made writing feel like the wrong response. Some things ask to be witnessed rather than recorded. Some things want you to put down the pen and just be present in them for a moment. I stood there until the cold was too much to argue with. Then I walked back through the still streets toward Charing Cross and caught the first train, and sat in the near-empty carriage with my hands in my lap and the frost cold still in my coat, thinking about a line that extends a long way back and a long way forward, and the people stationed along it who spend their nights making sure it holds. There's a version of this story that ends with something grand, an incident, a threat neutralized, a moment of public bravery that gets filmed and shared and viewed 1,000,000 times. That version is a better film, probably. But that isn't what I saw. What I saw was something quieter, and I think now, having sat with it for all this time, something rarer. I saw the inside of a practice that has survived not because it looks impressive from the outside, though it does, but because the people inside it take it seriously in the way you can only take something seriously when you understand exactly what is at stake and have decided, with full knowledge of that, to show up anyway. In the dark, in the cold, before anyone else is watching. Passing the night's knowledge to the next pair of hands. Proving with every handover that the line held. When you stand in front of the palace in the afternoon sun, camera raised, trying to make the guard blink, remember that at 4 in the morning, that same post was alive in a way you'll never see. And the person who stood there carried something through the dark that they passed to the next person who carried it forward to the next, and the night closed over it like water, and the city woke up not knowing. And that is precisely how it was supposed to work.